The arrogant 3-star Michelin chef threw a single dad's homemade lunchbox onto the floor, calling his cooking pig slop in front of a packed dining room. But when a disguised, world-renowned food critic tasted the spilled soup by accident and declared it the greatest dish of the decade, the arrogant chef was forced to beg on his knees. If you believe a father's love makes the best food, stay until the very end to see the most poetic revenge in history. The air inside L'Éclat, the city's only 3-star Michelin sanctuary, did not smell like a kitchen. It smelled of industrial-grade sanitizer, starched white, linens, and the terrifying sterile scent of absolute perfection. In this Didos building, mistake was a word that carried the penalty of exile. Arthur Vance moved through the stainless steel corridors of the basement like a ghost in his own life. He was 38, but his hands, thick with calluses and crisscrossed with faded burn scars, looked like they had survived a century of warfare. Arthur was a prep cook. He was the man who peeled 40 pounds of potatoes without looking up, the man who julienned carrots into microscopic needles, the man who washed the blood of expensive wagyu from the counters, so the stars could shine above. The narrator, watching from the high, shadowed corners of the ceiling, knew what the room did not, that those scarred hands once held the golden ladle of Paris before a betrayal by the very man who now called himself his boss had stripped him of his name, his restaurant, and his dignity. Arthur stayed at L'Éclat not because he lacked ambition, but because he had a son to raise, alone. Leo was 7 years old, with eyes that inherited his father's quiet intensity, but a spirit that had gone silent since his mother passed away 3 years ago. That Tuesday morning, the desert sun outside was a harsh, unforgiving yellow, but inside the kitchen, the temperature was a precise 68 degrees. Leo sat in the dry storage alcove, hidden behind bags of Italian flour and crates of vintage wine. His school had been closed for an emergency, and Arthur had no choice but to smuggle the boy into the fortress of the elite. "Stay here, Leo," Arthur whispered, his voice a low, steady rumble that was the only sound the boy trusted. He handed Leo a small, battered wooden lunchbox. It was hand-carved, smelling faintly of cedar and the rich, complex aroma of the slow-simmered bone. Broth Arthur had started at 3 a.m. "Don't open it until noon. It's still dreaming." Leo nodded, clutching the box to his chest like a holy relic. Arthur straightened his back, feeling the heavy weight of his faded blue apron, and prepared to face the man who had stolen his soul. Chef Julian Sterling did not walk into a room, he occupied it. He was 42, with hair that was too black to be natural, and a custom-tailored chef's coat that cost more than Arthur's car. Julian was the alchemist of flavor, a main, the Norstorichnor, whose face was on every magazine cover and whose temper was a legend in the culinary world. To Julian, a kitchen was not a place of nourishment. It was a battlefield where he was the only general. He measured human worth entirely by net worth and the precision of a plating tweezer. Julian stopped at Arthur's station, his nostrils flaring as if he were detecting a scent of inadequacy. He looked at the onions Arthur had diced. They were perfect, identical. This bothered Julian. He hated that the man he had once betrayed was the only one in the kitchen who truly understood the fundamentals. "Arthur," Julian hissed, the word landing like a small, cold accusation. "The Quarterly Investors Review is today. The most powerful critics in the country are sitting in that dining room. If I see a single drop of water on this floor, or a single hair out of place, I will fire you before you can blink. Do you understand, you peasant?" Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He looked at Julian with the steadiness that only comes from standing in places far darker than a glass-walled kitchen. "Yes, chef," he said, his voice as flat as the stainless steel counter. Julian sneered, his lip curling into that arrogant smirk he used for the cameras. Try to put some effort into it today. I know your type, content to stay in the mud. Some of us were born to touch the stars. Andino vori and dii. Julian turned on his heel, his brioni shoes clicking sharply against the tile, entirely unaware that the man he had just insulted was the person who had written the very recipes that had given him his first star. The narrator observed the subtle tightening of Arthur's jaw. He was a man who had already decided how the meeting would end, but for now, he simply picked up his knife. The blade was old, the handle worn, but the edge was sharper than anything Julian had ever owned. The morning rush at L'Éclat began like a perfectly choreographed ballet of cruelty. Orders were barked, stainless steel rattled, and the air grew thick with the humidity of boiling stocks and the mounting pressure of Julian, Sterling's ego. Arthur worked in the shadows, his hands moving with a silent, terrifying efficiency. He deglazed pans with a rhythm that suggested he was hearing music no one else could, a ghost melody from a kitchen in Paris that had burned down under suspicious circumstances 3 years ago. The narrator, drifting through the sterile hallways, watched as a man in a disheveled trench coat and a hat pulled low over his eyes entered the dining room. One ein sturs, room. He did not look like the typical billionaire clientele who came to L'Éclat to be seen. He looked like a man who had walked across the world simply to find a reason to keep living. The hostess tried to divert him to a corner table near the restrooms, her smile tight and plastic, but the man held up a card with a gold-bordered seal. The hostess's face went translucent. This was Silas Beaumont, the most feared culinary critic in the Western world, H.E. and Foroe Tunstansar, man whose single paragraph could bankrupt a franchise or turn a line cook into a god. He was in disguise, but the authority he radiated was impossible to mask. He took a seat in the center of the room, his eyes scanning the menu not for ingredients, but for the soul of the establishment. Inside the kitchen, Julian Thorne was hyperventilating. He had seen the hostess's signal. "He's here," Julian whispered, his hands trembling as he reached for a gold-leafed plating tweezer. "Beaumont is here." "Arthur, where is the reduction?" "Move, you useless slug!" Arthur emerged from the storage alcove carrying a tray of herbs. He had just spent 30 seconds checking on Leo. The boy was sitting perfectly still, leaning against a bag of flour, watching the steam rise from his lunchbox. The betrayal. Van die styrofoam the tools. Cedar box was closed, but the aroma was beginning to escape, a scent of roasted marrow, toasted star anise, and a secret blend of herbs that had been passed down through the Vance family for 4 generations. It was a water-based alchemy that didn't rely on expensive truffles. It relied on time. "The reduction is ready, chef," Arthur said, his voice a steady anchor in the sea of Julian's panic. But Julian wasn't listening. His paranoia was a living thing, clawing at the inside of his skull. He knew his own recipes were shallow. He knew he was a curator of shadows, plating beautiful lies for people who had too much money and too little taste. He followed Arthur's gaze toward the storage room. "What are you hiding in there?" Julian hissed, his nostrils flaring. "I told you, no distractions. The investors are watching the kitchen feed." Julian pushed past Arthur, his brioni coat brushing against the rough canvas of Arthur's apron. He kicked open the storage door. The narrator observed the scene. As if through a high-definition lens, the small boy curled on the blanket, the oversized headphones, and the humble wooden lunchbox sitting on a crate. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that precedes a lightning strike. "You brought a brat into my sanctuary?" Julian's voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, vibrating growl of pure malice. He looked at Leo, then at the lunchbox. "The betrayal. Van die styrofoam the tools." Scent of the broth hit him, a smell so complex and deep that it made his own High-end stocks smell like dishwater. Julian's ego couldn't handle the competition. He reached out and snatched the wooden box from the child's lap. Leo let out a small, sharp gasp. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He simply stared up at the man in the white coat with eyes that had seen too much loss to be surprised by cruelty. "Julian, put it down," Arthur said. The prep cook was standing in the doorway. Now, he hadn't moved an inch, but the energy around him had shifted. Fucker. The quiet. Competence was gone, replaced by a still, cold power. He stood a full head, taller than Julian, his scarred hands hanging loosely at his sides. "This?" Julian sneered, holding the box up like it was a piece of evidence in a crime. "You're feeding this garbage to a kid in my kitchen? During a Michelin me, maître source, navardrance, riff, weeks test, stir review? This is pig slop." Julian marched back into the main kitchen, the cameras following his every move. The line cooks froze. The socialites in the dining room watched through the glass partition. Julian wanted a spectacle. He wanted to humiliate Arthur so deeply that the prep cook would never dare to look him in the eye again. "Look at this, everyone!" Julian shouted to the room, his face contorted into an arrogant smirk. "Our resident expert prep cook thinks he's a chef. He brings his defective kid and his beggar's soup into my 3-star kitchen. Wonderbroschi." With a violent, sweeping motion, Julian slammed the wooden lunchbox onto the hard tile floor. The cedar wood splintered. The internal thermos shattered. The golden, amber, broth, the work of 9 hours of labor and 3 centuries of Vance family, a history, splashed across the white tiles, soaking Julian's immaculate shoes and spreading like a wasted sun toward the dining room doors. Leo appeared in the doorway, his small hands clutching his stuffed rabbit, his eyes fixed on the puddle of his father's love cooling on the floor. The boy made a sound, not a cry, but a broken, jagged intake of breath that was more painful to hear than any scream. He fell to his knees, his small fingers hovering over the spilled liquid, trying to save the only thing that felt like home. "There," Julian spat, pointing at the mess. "Clean it up. Then take your brat and get out. You're fired, Arthur, and I'll make sure you never wash a dish in this town again." Arthur stood perfectly still. The kitchen was silent except for the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of the broth falling from the edge of the storage crate. "The betrayals, for the twos." Narrator watched Arthur's fists clench until the knuckles turned as white as the tiles. For the first time in 3 years, the fire of the golden ladle was not just a memory. It was an inferno. But then the dining room doors swung open. Silas Beaumont walked in. He didn't wait for an invitation. He didn't look at Julian. He was looking at the floor. He was looking at the boy on his knees. And then the billionaire critic did something that made the board of directors stop breathing. He knelt down in the broth. Silas Beaumont, a man who could afford any meal on any continent, ignored the starched creases of his expensive trousers and let his knees press into the cooling golden liquid. The entire kitchen staff stood like statues carved from ice. Julian Thorne's breath hitched in his throat, his face transitioning from a mask of triumph into a sickly, translucent shade of ashen gray. The narrator, observing the scene from the rafters, saw the geometry of the room shift. The power no longer radiated from the man with the 3-star jacket, but from the puddle on the floor. Beaumont didn't use a silver spoon. He dipped a trembling finger into the broth and brought it to his lips. He closed his eyes. For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the room was the low hum of the industrial refrigerators. A single solitary tear escaped from under Beaumont's hat and fell into the mess. "Mr. Beaumont," Julian stammered, his voice high and brittle, a reed cracking in. "Ein Wakini." "A storm. I am so incredibly sorry for this wife." this filth. My employee has had a psychotic break. Please let me escort you back. I gakuri e sawansai. He have a wagyu tartare with gold leaf and white truffles waiting for you. This slop is literal waste. Beaumont opened his eyes. They weren't the eyes of a critic anymore. They were the eyes of a man who had finally found a ghost he'd been chasing for a decade. He ignored Julian entirely. He looked at Leo, the small boy who was still staring at the shattered wood of his cedar box. "Who made this?" Beaumont whispered. The voice carried a resonance that silenced the distant clatter of the dining room. Julian stepped forward, his ego overriding his survival instinct. "It's a failed experiment, sir." Arthur, the prep cook, was trying to hide his incompetence. "I was just disposing of it." "Shut your mouth, Julian," Beaumont said, his tone as flat and lethal as a guillotine blade. The billionaire stood up slowly, the golden broth staining his designer suit, and turned his gaze to Arthur Vance. "I have spent 7 years and millions of dollars traveling from Lyon to Tokyo, looking for this exact sequence of star anise, roasted marrow, and patience," Beaumont said. He stepped toward Arthur, his footsteps wet and heavy on the tile. "There is only one man in history who knew how to make the mother's broth. He was the head of the Vance dynasty in Paris. They told me he died in the restaurant fire that you, Julian, claimed to be the only survivor of." The silence that followed was complete, a suffocating silence that made the line cooks lower their heads. Julian Thorne's smirk didn't just fade. It evaporated. He looked at the floor, then at the cameras, and realized that for the first time in his life, he couldn't plait a lie beautifully enough to hide the truth. "He didn't die," Arthur said. His voice was no longer the flat monotone of a servant. It was the deep, commanding baritone of a master. He reached down and picked up Leo, holding the boy against his shoulder. He just learned that the people he shared his soul with were more interested in the stars on the wall than the people in the seats. "Arthur Vance," Beaumont said, his voice thick with a respect he had never shown. "A single billionaire. You are the soul this industry lost. And Julian, you, Satri, are merely a curator of shadows." Beaumont turned back to the room. "The review is over. L'Eclat doesn't have 3 stars. It has 0. Because a kitchen that mocks a father's love for his child doesn't deserve to boil water, let alone serve the elite. The collapse of Julian Thorne's empire happened in the time it takes for a sauce to break. Within an hour, the board of directors had seen the feed. Within 2 hours, the investors had pulled their funding. Julian stood in the center of his empty kitchen, his shoes still soaked in the Vance family legacy, watching as the world he built on theft burned to the ground. He found Arthur in the parking lot, loading Leo into a dented 10-year-old truck. Julian, the man who measured human worth by net worth, dropped to his knees on the hot asphalt. "Arthur, please," Julian begged, his custom-tailored coat dragging in the dust. "The Michelin Guide is stripping my name. My career is over. Give me the herb. Ratios, just the ratios. I'll give you half the company. I'll give you the corner office. I'm begging you. Save me." Arthur Vance looked down at the man who had stolen his name and destroyed his life 3 years ago. He didn't feel anger. He felt a profound, weary pity. He measured the man in front of him and found him worth nothing but a single, cold observation. "You can't buy time, Julian," Arthur said. "And you certainly can't buy love. You plate beautiful lies, but you can't cook the truth. You don't need a recipe. You need a soul." Arthur started the engine. Leo, sitting in the passenger seat, rolled down the window. The boy, who hadn't spoken a word since the morning he saw his mother vanish into the white light of a hospital room, looked at the crying, ruined CEO. "My daddy's soup tastes like home," Leo said, his voice small but as clear as a bell in the desert air. "Your food tastes like nothing." Julian Sterling stayed on his knees until the taillights of the old truck vanished into the twilight. He was the most famous chef in the country, and he was the only person in the world who was truly starving. 3 months later, a small, nameless shop opened in the East End. There were no white linens, there was no gold leaf. There was only a long wooden table and a single pot of broth simmering on the stove. Silas Beaumont sat at the corner every day, not to write a review, but to remember why he loved to eat. And Arthur Vance, the man the powerful dismissed, stood behind the counter with his son, proving that true power never has to shout to be heard. It only has to be real.